So good afternoon and welcome to the Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition's monthly webinar. And this month, our webinar topic is Human Trafficking 101. As always, with all of our events, we are going to start off with a prayer, and then I'll introduce our speakers and let them take it away, and then come back and have question and answers. We ask that during the webinar, you put your question and answers in the chat, and we will most definitely try to get to all of our questions before the end of this program. So let us just place ourselves in the presence of God. I should introduce myself. My name is Kimberly Limore. I am on the executive committee of the CPMC and also a pastoral associate in Chicago. Let's put ourselves in the presence of God now. I found a prayer for the end of human trafficking that came out of the USCCB, but is shared by the Sisters of Charity of St. Elizabeth Convent Station, New Jersey. God of freedom, beauty, and truth, we believe that your deepest desire, your most powerful energy, is that all creation might know abundant life. We raise our voices in anguish prayer for our sisters and brothers, women and girls, men and boys who are modern day slaves. They are your beloved daughters and sons, exploited sexually or forced to work because of human violence and greed. Fill us with your holy anger and your sacred passion, that those who are trafficked might know healing and justice, that traffickers will come to repentance and conversion, that all of us might live in such a way that others are not made to pay the price for our comfort and convenience. Hasten the coming of the day when all people and our precious earth itself will be treated not as a commodity, but as radiant images of your freedom, of your beauty, and of your truth. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So today we welcome two young ladies from the USCCB. The first, I am going to introduce Felicitas Brugo Onetti, is the Anti-Trafficking Education and Outreach Coordinator at the Migration and Refugee Services Department at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. She was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Felicitas always felt drawn to working with immigrant populations. Felicitas has also worked in the Institute for Family Violence Studies, housed at Florida State University College of Social Work in this role. She helped develop trainings for the Department of Children and Family Services, families in Florida, along with lawyers, doctors, nurses, and other professionals working with children and families. Also, I'd like to introduce Marsha Forson. She is a policy advisor for the Department of Migration and Refugee Services at the USCCB. She has interned with the USCCB in the Human Development, where she discovered a passion for the church's social teaching. After working as a nurse for 3.5 years, she decided to pursue a lifelong interest in refugee and migration work. So today we just offer a warm welcome to both Felicitas and Marsha as they present on Human Trafficking 101. And again, we will come back later with Q&A. Take it away, Felicitas.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you all for having us here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and hopefully this works. Great. So my name is Felicitas and I work in MRS at USCCB. And so we're going to go a little bit on the overview of human trafficking and kind of what that looks like. So a little bit of the agenda for today. So we're going to kind of go over some defining terms on human trafficking, the Catholic response, right? What does Catholic social teaching say about this? What does it look like? A bit of like victim identification, screening, risk factors, child victims of trafficking, effects of trauma, mental health, and a brief point of confidentiality, the intersection of other issues in trafficking, and then just provide some resources and reports and other information for you all to look at on your own time and whatever that may be. So defining terms. I like to say that human trafficking is an umbrella term for the most part, because it kind of divides into, sex trafficking, labor trafficking, and then you have different forms of exploitation, and then you go into children, and then those two sectors. So the more, defining terms is human trafficking is the use of force, fraud, or coercion to induce someone into labor or sexual exploitation. Many call it modern day slavery. In different parts of the world, you hear different things. In Europe, you hear a lot more modern day slavery. And here in the US, you hear a little bit more human trafficking as a term. Evidently, it's a violation of human rights. And in the United States, it is a federal crime. It is illegal in all 50 states, especially if you are a minor. So to date, 28 million people live in forced labor, bonded labor, or sexual exploitation. And this kind of varies and changes, although we don't have the most accurate reports on it. It kind of is varying between, some people would argue that globally we see, 28 to 40 million, which is a pretty big discrepancy, but that's just kind of the nature of the reporting tactics that we have today. So a quick little overview on one legislation that Marsha will get into, but Trafficking Victims Protection Act is pretty much the main legislation that protects victims. And the definition for the most part is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. So when we get into kind of what human trafficking is, there's this component of the AMP model. So it's action, means, and how. Action, means, and end. So, the action would be recruiting, transportation, obtaining. The means would be force, fraud, and coercion. And the end would be, for exploitation of involuntary servitude, debt bondage, labor trafficking, commercial sexual exploitation, fraud, etc. So just as a kind of a brief overview. So the Catholic response, of course, the Catholic Church, would advocate that this is a violation of human rights and human dignity. A quick statement by the USCCB, which on the Committee of Migration stated that human trafficking is a horrific crime against the basic dignity and rights of the human person, and all efforts must be expanded to end it. And since then, we've been, working in this department to kind of end anti-trafficking or help facilitate the prevention and education on helping individuals, empowering them by understanding the signs and how to be victimized. And we've been working on this for decades, and now we have something called the Anti-Trafficking program, which is where I work and what I'm doing. So Catholic teaching on human trafficking. The Church's resounding opposition to human trafficking is rooted in the principles of Catholic social teaching, the sacredness and dignity of human life. Our catechism forbids acts or enterprises that for any reason lead to the enslavement of human beings, to their being bought, sold, and exchanged like merchandise and disregarded for their personal dignity. In a big part of what we also kind of advocate for is the dignity of work. This not only is the dignity of the person, but people deserve to kind of have jobs that provide for their families and for themselves, and contributing to the economy and being, having a dignified work life is important to Catholics and a big advocacy piece for the Church. So here we have a big priority of responding. So again, the dignity of the human person, dignity of work, preferential option for the poor. Especially here, we have a big part of protection for migrants, when you see that migrants can be often victimized by trafficking, when you kind of fall into smuggling and trafficking. And then kind of talking about the commercialization of sexuality and kind of what that means. And to the left, we have a picture here of St. Josephine Bakita, which is the patron saint of victims of human trafficking. And she is also the patron saint of Sudan and the patron saint of African Catholics here in the United States. She was a slave and from Sudan, and was a slave and was kind of traveled all over Europe until she realized she was able to be free, but she was trafficked for most of her childhood and became a religious sister in Italy. So getting to the basis of things, I see that there's something in the chat. I don't know if that's, okay, sorry about that. So who are victims? Victims kind of have a pretty broad sector of who they can be. A lot of people would say, victimization doesn't really discriminate. It can affect everyone, meaning anyone can be a victim. And there's a lot of truth to that. And then, of course, there's always going to be some discrepancies in what, who will be more targeted. So again, the number of people who are trafficked globally is unknown. Current estimate is at 25 million. The previous slides showed 28. And as I was saying prior, that there's, 25 to 40 that we assume are being exploited for labor or commercial sexual exploitation. So oftentimes people that are victimized are people suffering from poverty, disadvantaged communities, marginalized groups that are disproportionately affected, specific ACEs that someone may have. ACEs refer to adverse childhood experiences, and there's kind of categories in which people that are more exposed to trauma will more likely be victimized. So in the US context, just to keep it for here, victims include citizens and foreign nationals. And so migrants we talk a lot about smuggling and trafficking, and migrants kind of have a different discrepancy when they are being trafficked en route to the United States, or once they arrive, or during their travels. So that is just a different part of it. But victims can include citizens and foreign nationals, and pretty much anyone. So anyone can be a victim. Again, so we have a couple here of categories. So people that are educated or non-formal education, men, women, and children, individuals, families, or groups, documented or undocumented, diversity of nationality, diverse in age, race, class, gender, religion, and culture. So the main industries of concern for forced labor and commercial sex acts include, for sexual exploitation, we have, prostitution, which can include brothels, cantinas, internet, which can lead to, pornography or websites with sexual content, street-based, recruitment from kind of on the streets and in bars and clubs around neighborhoods that predominantly might focus on that, pornography, online sex chat services, illicit massage parlors, exotic dancing. And then for labor trafficking, we see a lot more in agriculture, fishing, and food processing facilities and factories, packaging, shipping, labeling, construction, landscaping, hospitality and service industry, restaurants, nightclubs, hotels, things like that, domestic work, housekeeping, and maids and nannies, nursing homes, and a lot of personal care, as you see in nail salons, hair salons, or just like those kind of salons that have spa, or those like all-inclusive places. So some tactics used by perpetrators include physical and sexual abuse. Oftentimes people are threatened against by their perpetrators, and there's threats against the victim or the victim's family, and this can vary depending on both the status of immigration. A lot of times people use this tactic specifically with people that may be undocumented or are visiting, or just happen to kind of get stuck through travel and things like that. But it can also apply to people that live here domestically. Withholding income or wages, psychological abuse and manipulation, including tactics to create kind of dependency and falling into that kind of intimate partner violence and trauma bonding, use of shame against the victim, debt bondage, restricted contact, drug or alcohol dependency, and making the victim believe they will be arrested if they escape. And a lot of these tactics that are used work in ways that individuals are already kind of in that place. We see a lot of times victims that may be already afraid of law enforcement due to perhaps where they grew up or what they know about law enforcement or prior experiences due to prior trauma. And so these manipulation tactics usually feed on the, let's say, call them insecurities or the situations in which people will already kind of be in. So that's kind of some of the main tactics. So who can encounter victims? I think when we're doing a little bit of what this audience is kind of here for, right? Anyone can really encounter victims. So we see victims in, of course, a lot of social work environments, or medical professionals or healthcare professionals might experience a lot of these things. People working in clinics, in communities and parishes, a lot of charity work where you might be places like Goodwill, or places with like soup kitchens or things, homeless shelters. You see a lot of medical personnel, of course, national and local police, human rights advocates, religious workers again. And then, you see this a lot in hotels and restaurants and salons. And a lot of times you see a lot of hotels and kind of organizations that will have a lot of prevention efforts, PSA, public service announcements. You see this a lot in airports. You'll see them on buses, depends where you kind of are. Sometimes there's a couple of PSAs that have the human trafficking hotline. So really anyone can encounter a victim. And that's kind of the main part of knowing kind of how to identify or what to do. So challenges of self-identification. So the biggest problem with human trafficking is primarily that it is people like to call it a hidden crime, is very clandestine in nature. And it can be very challenging for the individual to self-identify and for someone to identify, as I was saying prior. Because of the nature of how organizations are ran, victims fall into very specific boxes that can make it very hard to report. So when you have lack of resources, whether that's due to poverty in a community or language barriers, right? People that maybe speak their native language, whether that's, Spanish, French, or Italian, or different parts of Europe or the Middle East, or kind of that immigrant population that might not speak their native language, you see a lot of discrepancies there in wanting to report. And so language barriers are a big challenge, along with the resources that are provided in that community. If there, how I was saying before, if there is kind of a tense relationship with law enforcement or with law officials within that community, people might be even less willing to report. And so it continues this hidden nature of the crime, which is why we don't have these estimated reports and all these, accurate numbers to kind of share with people. So a lot of people are exploited among marginalized communities. And human trafficking involves a lot of different crimes at the same time. We can dive into domestic violence. We can dive into intimate partner violence. We can dive into just, substance use. We can dive into different sectors in which a lot of times human trafficking may not be so clear. And oftentimes victims are kind of, they might not always think they are a victim, or don't really know what that means, right? This general lack of understanding and lack of awareness of what trafficking looks like, or lack of understanding of how they're supposed to be treated by, someone in their family or someone that they're with. So victims rarely self-identify, and you'll see different reports that might say different things, and that changes within kind of like the state statutes and different parts of the world, right? Like depending on the support within a community, a lot of victims do self-identify. And so reports kind of show, it's a little bit contradicting sometimes what reports will show. So it's hard to really know kind of accurate statistics, but for the most part, victims really do rarely self-identify, or it might take a while to ask for help. In domestic violence situations, we see that it takes 7 attempts of violence towards the victim for the victim to get out of the relationship, or to seek help, or to, kind of understand that they're in an abusive relationship or something like that. And so when we think of a situation like that, imagine victims of trafficking that might, think that this is a normal way of being. When you see labor trafficking and individuals that maybe come to this country for better employment, that's what they may understand is the culture here and how things work. So there's very big discrepancies on what identification may look like. So continuing the challenges, clear recognitions of their own criminal activities. They do not realize they are victims and may have rights. This applies a lot to migrant communities. This applies a lot maybe to even minority, like children, people that are underage. They might not really know what their rights are. Even sometimes, as an adult, you're like, I don't really know if I can do these things or not do these things. And so, what are our rights and what are the things that we're able to advocate for ourselves? And having people that kind of educate on this topic is important. And not all communities have this. Fearful of being imprisoned or deported, a feeling of shame and disgrace, fearful of endangering their family due to threats, mistrust in authorities, believing the situation will get better. And this is where you see a lot of these intersections of other different types of relationships. Communication obstacles, right? These language barriers that I was mentioning, may believe their debts are an obligation to repay, physically isolated or guarded, trauma bonds to trafficker. So to kind of touch on point number 3 to the left, fear of being imprisoned. A lot of times victims that are in trafficking situations can be forced to commit crimes in general, or specifically for their perpetrator. And here, people will be like, well, I also, took part in this crime. Like, how can I kind of ask for help because you're in a situation in which you are also, in the eyes of the law, maybe guilty. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but just to give an example, I worked a lot with individuals I worked in a substance use rehabilitation clinic. So a lot of my clients were specifically focused with substance use recovery. And you see here a lot of the issues in which people will commit crimes out of force or out of will, but you're doing it in terms of the relationship that you were in. So you see here a lot how people kind of get trapped into these situations. You see in labor trafficking often how, employers will, let's say, we'll have these recruitment fees and be like, you're going to work, you're going to work on this boat, and there are some fees, and I'll pay for your uniform, and then you'll pay me back. And then they'll set interest rates of 80% of what was owed, and they get paid, let's say, $5 an hour. And so keeping people in debt that they will never repay this one payment, and then having to kind of keep their paychecks for these people to feel like they're obligated to repay. And so people don't leave situations thinking they may owe a debt to someone, which is at a crazy interest rate that they'll never pay back. And two, that's, employers can't keep your paychecks and things like that. And so it goes into not knowing your rights, not knowing the situation you're in, and a lot of times physically isolated, right? Victims oftentimes are very overprotected kind of by their traffickers. They are in situations in which they don't really, sometimes you see a lot of women that might not go out on their own, or they're always accompanied by someone, or people are speaking for them, or that they are isolated by their family. People that are manipulating, these perpetrators that are manipulating these situations, find ways to kind of isolate the individual. So it's easier to brainwash and kind of manipulate and continue that psychological kind of trauma inflicting. So some signs of an individual that maybe, that could be a potential victim of trafficking. I think it's also interesting to kind of take these with a grain of salt, because a lot of times, not always is it the case. Some people may be in situations of fear and anxiety, but not necessarily be victims of trafficking. So unable to leave the work environment, you see that a lot in labor trafficking, and both sex and labor trafficking, but predominantly labor trafficking, where you see people that might live where they work, or they see that they work 13 hours a day, 5 days a week, or 7 days a week. And everything is about kind of the work and the employer. Have limited contact with family or friends, kind of what I was saying prior, this idea of isolation. Someone controlling where they go, maybe there's an employer that takes everyone everywhere, or there's a driver that takes them everywhere and they get picked up, and there's different ways that this can look. Not being allowed to speak for themselves, again, someone being accompanied and kind of having this, dominant person speaking on their behalf, or scripted, or just kind of showing their dominant presence, even if the individual is speaking, maybe perhaps it's recited or kind of scripted talk. Show of fear and anxiety, suffering of injuries, of assault, control measures, things like that, bruises, sometimes malnutrition, or hygienic needs, act as if they are instructed by someone else. Again, this kind of scriptured talk, or this very broad, or very, tailored and kind of not very informative or detailed conversation, and then receive little or no payment for the work that they are doing. Work excessively long hours over long periods of time. So that can look from weeks to months to years, or be trapped in a situation in which they're working very long hours with very little pay and very long periods, and isolation. So it kind of varies. So some risk factors. When we think of vulnerable individuals, and that could be very broad, right? There's ethnic origins, being part of an ethnic or cultural group, being part of a specific neighborhood, being part of a specific income class, right? Socioeconomic status, educational experience, employment opportunities, being from a place where maybe there are very little employment opportunities, kind of create these ACEs, right? These adverse childhood experiences that can induce and continue to promote victimization in many different types of ways, but specifically in human trafficking, right? So people living in persistent poverty, a lot of times perpetrators will come at that angle of this new opportunity of life, right? This new employment opportunity, this new way that you're going to make all this money and you're going to provide for your family and you're going to, just succeed out of this bubble that you grew up in. So perpetrators use these tactics to kind of keep people in these situations, but also to promise, empty promises of better life. So lack of educational and employment opportunities, family breakdown or lack of family support. When the family is unstable, oftentimes people prey on that, right? In a lot of different scenarios, but in human trafficking predominantly, promising this this protection, this safety, this love that you don't get at home. Let me kind of, I can do that for you. I can be that person for you. Gender, racial, and ethnic discrimination, communities with high crime, weak communities, perhaps some that don't have support, that maybe don't have a lot of people, that don't have these community leaders or don't have a community voice. You see it a lot with maybe, communities that are kind of like, they're very polarized, or they're very, there's a lot of tense energy in it, or there's a lot of discrepancies with law enforcement. You see this a lot, for example, in Native American communities, right? These sometimes you have between federal, between the government and tribal nations, you see a discrepancy in these ties and how it's hard to work together, these big barriers that kind of leave room for perpetrators to exploit victims. Low awareness of workers' rights, right? Illiterate, uneducated, perhaps language barriers, again, immigrants, right? Are these situations in which there might be low awareness, but people that are not able to also help guide these conversations and promote this wellness or awareness. Low self-esteem, history of abuse, displaced people on the move, migrants, things like that. And a lot of times you see people with these, high risks of exposure and these risk factors that they have will often be, kind of risk takers, maybe a little more ambitious, or sometimes will engage in risky behavior. And that could be risky sexual behavior, risky substance use behavior, risky criminal behavior, things like that. And so people are kind of preying on that stuff. So just to touch really briefly on human trafficking in children. So children have, I see here that it's a little cut off, but children have heightened risk factors, right? Their sex, boys and girls are very sought after in both sexually abusive situations and pornography and images. So you see here a lot of connection with, kind of child sexual abuse. You see a lot of child pornography, child images, like sexual activity online, in which sometimes can bleed into human trafficking, and a lot of times labor trafficking, right? Globally, you see, children that might work in in factories or work in mines because they might be smaller and they will fit into these very uncomfortable situations, or just are trying to provide a work for their family. In some places in Europe, or in Asia, you see a lot of child boxing or child boxing rings in which children are paid to fight. And it's a boxing betting ring in which adults will watch children fight. And it's a specific age group, and it's specifically men, and it's specifically boys and younger girls within the age of 9 to 14, in which that is a profession to honor your family. And kids die in the ring. And they are forced to do this, and kids think that that's kind of something that's an honor that comes to their family. And so age is very important when it comes to children, because there's children are very sought out after. They're specific places in which perpetrators will want them in. Children with disabilities, right? If children have probably lower educational levels, or kind of emotional impairments, developmental disabilities, things like that, they're very easy to kind of manipulate and take advantage of. Exposure to negative peer pressure, gangs, violence, etc., things like that. Separation from family. You see a lot of runaway youth, a lot of homeless runaway youth living with extended families, separated by migration or displacement. You see here again, this unstable nature of the family kind of puts children in a very good place for perpetrators to take advantage of. Position within the family. Sometimes you see these discriminatory cultural practices that kind of help heighten isolation for the child, or promote different honors. And so a child may be kind of like the ugly duck in the family, or the lost sheep, so to say. And so perpetrators prey specifically on these practices. And then, of course, by the nature of being younger, sometimes you have just a little bit of ignorance and a little bit of naiveness in a younger child, thinking, they may know more than they do, and that's not often the case. Or it can be in different ways, but kind of they maybe don't know more beyond their nuclear family, and kind of don't have much of an understanding. Or on the opposite end, they think they are perhaps older than they are, and so then they are put into situations that may be for adult content, and get exploited that way as well. So special considerations: children are very specific when it comes to dealing with trauma and working in kind of with these environments. So, or in situations in which they are exploited. When it comes to authority figures, children often want to please and respond based on what you want to believe and hear. A lot of times their age and response to trauma can regress people to be more developmentally disabled than they are, or can be a good leeway for perpetrators to kind of get into, to kind of use this as an exploitative tactic. So a lot of times they have trauma bonds, right? They find if they are this, black sheep of the family, and their trafficker is like, I'll protect you, and in my life, you're the priority. A kid will, or a child will kind of bond in a way that it obviously is harmful to their well-being, because the perpetrator is still violent or still exploiting the individual. But because they felt this way prior with their own family, they might just like kind of hold on to these relationships more so because they have nothing to go back to. So they may feel ashamed about what they agreed to do or what happened, lack of understanding of his or her rights or the general situation. So you see a lot of issues when they report and things like that. Less sophisticated understanding of systems, inability to make like long-term decisions, and more likely to believe these threats that perpetrators may use. So family risk factors for both like children and kind of general, you see like, again, these ACEs, these adverse childhood experiences, these single parent family, or someone or a parent that may be like regularly absent, or you have like the large household size that there's just a lot of families residing together. And it's maybe just like an overwhelming, overstimulated household, insufficient income, illness or death, power relationships, right? These kind of like gender roles again, having the man of the house or the woman of the house or whoever's leading the family. And if those are healthy power balances versus unhealthy, you can have both. But oftentimes in these situations, it could be these like unhealthy power relationships, family violence, discriminatory traditional or cultural practices, preference for male, female child. You see this in a lot of different cultures, maybe not so much in the United States, but you see this in some ways, perhaps in immigrant families or just in families residing elsewhere where there's like these cultural discriminatory practices and just like these preferences of the child in recent migration. So community risk factors, again, kind of this, community violence, gangs, under-resourced schools, high rates of dropouts, youth overemployment or youth underemployment, not having these opportunities, places, states where there's maybe a lot of isolation in which, the town might be the center, but there's no opportunity for more, or places isolated perhaps from big cities in which it's very easy to perpetrate, or it's very easy to exploit for perpetrators. Lack of safe environments, outlets, community centers, parks, recreational centers, kind of these like places where people gather. Location, close to perhaps a higher income community, or a city, a place that you're near 40 minutes from a big city like Boston, and where there's a lot more opportunity, or just like more resources for that community. Tension between local community and policing, weak child protection systems, and leadership and power structures. So reducing child vulnerability, this is just a quick piece of just having open communication, knowing like the child's friends and acquaintances, monitoring internet, media, and kind of like educating on these topics. And I would even say that this is very transferable to adults, not even so much children, but just creating these safe spaces in which you are going to be kind of bringing up the realities of maybe someone's life and having ways and supports and resources to kind of educate about the risks and realities of human trafficking, knowing what's going on, having an open dialogue, and providing age appropriate, right, for educational, social, and economic opportunities. You see a lot of times adults with extensive, emotional intelligence or developmental delays due to like trauma exposure, that they've regressed perhaps a couple of years due to all these things. And so creating appropriate content and creating dialogue that helps the individual understand, right? Like meeting your clients or meeting the individual at where they're supposed to be at. When we think of, prisons, as we are speaking for Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition, a lot of times you have lower literacy levels with inmates that might be residing inside the jails or prisons. You may have lower educational experiences, perhaps like improper dialogue, or not necessarily improper, but perhaps just a lower base knowledge of kind of how to form eloquent sentences, or have things that kind of feed the group that you were doing in the way that they are responsive to, right? If we have these big, complex, confusing information, we need to find ways to make it digestible for the audience that we are working with, specifically in this case, inmates, right? And people in prisons. So helping victims, what does this look like? Again, kind of this providing information that is digestible to the audience, encouraging coping skills, right? Building support systems, helping people understand what healthy relationships can look like, helping identifying their strengths, their weaknesses, and working on that stuff, right? Validating people's feelings, clients in this case, or individuals, kind of what a patient, however you want to kind of frame it, but being cognizant of your reactions, explaining trauma to symptoms, understanding and having this kind of approach of being trauma responsive, right? Like stepping into a room in which people are with high risks of exposure, many different things, and coming from a place in which that you are more of a listener than perhaps an advice giver, or just knowing how to, just being able to kind of find yourself in a room in which you are there as a support, and having this trauma responsive awareness, right? Suggesting individuals to participate in support groups, or kind of hosting that safe space. So we've kind of gotten into a lot of different things, but so here talking about, trauma responsive and people with high traumatic experiences prior or post their trafficking, during their exploitation. Trafficking victims can present with a variety of mental health needs, right? Prior and post. Like there can be people with already, these instances of trauma that then get heightened during their exploitation, and then kind of stay within their like post-exploitation, right? Most have endured a range of traumatic experiences during the trafficking incident, and may have experiences multiple leading up to the incident and after the incident, right? Like these are individuals that have high traumatic experiences and trauma responses. So many may struggle with PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, and a different range of conditions, right? Some people can develop other mental health disorders, dependency behaviors, substance use disorders, insomnia, bipolar, different things that are kind of triggered by the different, things in our body due to the experiences that we have. So trauma responses, personal and family history, right? Family dynamics. What does that look like? History of trauma. Do they have this prior history of trauma, of abuse, of sexual abuse, neglect, maltreatment, or witnessing abuse? What was the home environment like in general? And then what was it like during, being exploited? The socioeconomic background. What did they come from versus what they're in now? What educational background do they have? What is their environment? Seeing people's environment is a main reason of understanding kind of who they are and the supports that they may have. And so environment from all ranges of, right? What was it before then? What was it during exploitation? And what was it after? And so then this cultural context, again, what are their cultural norms? Like dealing with someone that might be, or speaking with an individual that has been exploited might be different when you're working with a migrant versus when you're working with a foreign born or a US citizen. And again, going back to that idea, going into a space, into a prison, there are different things going on there that might be even the culture within the prison, not so much, our ethnic cultures, but what is the culture in here, and how are we going to navigate like the ways in which people need to be understood, or in the ways that they want us to understand them. Gender issues, right? The discrepancies, both outside and inside. When we think of exploitative situations, what are the gender roles for women versus men in let's say, sexual exploitation? There are different degrees in which people are exploited for different things in the roles, right? A lot of times when women are sexually exploited, it's a very submissive role, right? Men are very dominant in that situation. Women are very discarded, are very used, are very degraded. And so understanding that a lot of times people may come out of these situations feeling that same way, or perhaps learning these behaviors of how to interact, let's say, with men, and then having to continuing that interaction throughout, their life. And then having to like understand how to break these norms in which, not all men will degrade you, for example. And vice versa. Like you have a lot of, with young boys or men, kind of this role of what it means to be a man, or like these kind of stereotypes of mental health in men, especially when you dive into cultural sectors, right? Respect of authority, and willingness to communicate emotions, kind of all these discrepancies that flood into, many mental health issues, or just many topics, but specifically in human trafficking. So in the trafficking situation, what type of level of and abuse was endured, if they have a children with the trafficker, that's a whole other, trauma bonding experience, right? They are kind of tied to this person through their child, and what that relationship, with the child may look like. And what that child may be missing, perhaps the perpetrator isn't a good parent. And so having to navigate that with the children is a kind of a different conversation. But, then perpetrators will have death threats to themselves or loved ones, witness horrific events, kind of the time frame, length of time, how old were they when they were first trafficked, what was the time that they were, how long were they being exploited for, how long has it been since they've been, rescued, and things like that, a number of traumatic incidents. So I just want to mention confidentiality really quickly. Confidentiality is very important when working with people with high risks of high exposure to trauma, high exposure to trauma, and very sensitive situations. So just making sure that you're always keeping the information that you have within the people that you are kind of meant to be with, whether that's the people within the prisons or who you're supposed to be reporting things to, whether that's within the organization. So always keeping names anonymous and keeping conversation pretty subtle. And then here we see just a little bit of substance use and trafficking. So people can be exploited by different means, people with prior substance use disorder being lured through their previous exposure to substances, being kept in exploitative situations to maintain obedience. Persons with substance use disorders are keeping them there and having them withdrawn, so they continue to exploit them. Being drugged to abuse them, maybe paid through substances, or committing crimes for a perpetrator. And then you see a lot of times, often victims using substance use as a coping mechanism. So we'll go some other kind of statistics of how criminalization and trafficking take place. Oftentimes the convicted of trafficking persons might not always be the perpetrator, it might be the victim. And so kind of talking about the rules and regulations that Marsha is actually going to get into on what that looks like when we the legislation that's supposed to protect victims but often doesn't. So these are just some statistics. Women and girls account for 71% of all traffic victims globally. Male victims represent 82% of trafficking and organ removals, and different reports have showed different things, which I have linked here. And different reasons why women are criminalized, reduced access to services, women and men are investigated at different rates, gender inequalities, gender-based violence, discriminatory labor, migration laws, conflict, post-conflict settings, and humanitarian crisis. So here are some two reports: the United Nations Office of Drug and Crimes Trafficking in Persons, Department of State Trafficking in Persons, which is the US kind of report, list of goods produced by child labor or forced labor, and some organizations to kind of support, and the resources that we have here at USCCB, the Become a Shepherd, Amistad, Compass, and BRICS, which does that whole kind of supporting migrants and refugees. And that's all, because I know we have to move it on. So sorry for the lengthy PowerPoint, and Marsha, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Felicitas. As we mentioned at the top, my name is Marsha. I have the privilege of working at the USCCB as a policy advisor in the Office of Policy and Advocacy, where we basically help the bishops carry the voice of the church to Congress and to the administration, working to promote policy positions, including those around human trafficking issues, in light of the dignity of the human person. Obviously supported throughout the church. Here's a quote from the Holy Father. My intent today is just to provide a brief overview just for your situational awareness of some of the major legislation and some of the work that's been done in this area over the past few decades. So firstly, we have the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 and its successors, which I will discuss in a bit more detail here in a second. We have the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act of 2014, various trade legislation and international agreements that get into very specific and detailed aspects of these issues, and then annual federal appropriations bills that provide the funds for these programs. So the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or TVPA, this was enacted in 2000. As Felicitas alluded to earlier, this is really a landmark piece of legislation that standardized federal law in the area of anti-trafficking. It has to be reauthorized every so often, and this has occurred through all of these years, as you can see here, and most recently in 2023. It's based on the 3 Ps. So firstly, we have protection. So we want foreign victim survivors to be eligible for federally funded services, such as the T and U visa. The U visa applies to those, or provides legal status to those for certain people who've experienced certain qualifying criminal activities. And the T non-immigrant visa applies to certain victims of human trafficking. It works also on prevention. So there was a creation of a task force to monitor and combat trafficking, and then prosecution. So it added new criminal provisions, increased penalties, and sort of enshrined in law that it's a crime, and to provide restitution for victims, as well as different forms of relief. Here I just have a list of some of the federal agencies that are involved in the President's Interagency Task Force to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. So you see here the Department of State, Defense, Justice, the Interior, and etc. Here's just an overview of some of the funding numbers, just to give you sort of a scale of the size of some of this work that's done across the US federal government. So we see more than 80 million for the Department of Justice's Office for Victims of Crime to support training and technical assistance and other capacity building programs. There's 30 million or so to the Department of Health and Human Services Office on Trafficking in Persons, 100 million for the State Department and their global anti-trafficking efforts, and then 7 billion for the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which works with various different populations, especially unaccompanied migrant children. In terms of the current legislative landscape, President Biden earlier this year signed into law the reauthorization of that 2000 TVPA. This time it's known as the Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Reauth Act of 2022. So it provides grants-making authority for the collection of data on dual status youth. So these are youth who encounter both child welfare and juvenile justice systems. It created a pilot program for youth at risk of being trafficked, requires a report to Congress on federal contract supply chains, and interestingly, supports research also on the impact of social media on human trafficking, and appropriates money to the Department of Homeland Security for their investigative work. Here are some other noteworthy bills introduced last Congress that didn't make it their way through. I know the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Reauth Act was widely supported by a variety of organizations, including in the Catholic nonprofit sphere. And then we have here, just for your awareness, and if anyone's curious, the Vatican released in 2019 something called the Pastoral Orientations on Human Trafficking, which were intended to align the church on the issue. Not an exhaustive sort of set of recommendations or anything, but just a useful guide for those involved in advocacy, dialogue, as well as in pastoral ministry. And in terms of ways that you can get involved, we have our Justice for Immigrants Coalition. I could include a link, but we've recently updated our Justice for Immigrants website, which includes education And if there are any advocacy alerts as new issues come up that we'd like to share with the public, you can find those there. There's the U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking that I believe you all are aware of from your prior webinars. And then you can always stay informed about developments from the different agencies within the federal government and their respective work to address the issues. I would look specifically at things like the Department of State and their Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. And they release an annual Trafficking in Persons report for anyone who might be curious. Okay, so in a nutshell, that's about all I have for you. Thanks so much for having us today.
Thank you, Marsha and Felicitas. It's a lot of information, a lot of good information, and it's a lot of good work that you all are doing in that. We appreciate that. I'm not sure if there are any questions in the chat. I don't see any. Is anybody, if you have a question, please put it in the chat so we can address that real quick.
I think there's a question for you, Marsha, that if there's a specific bill people should be working on.
At this time, we aren't tracking anything. Our main thing last year was trying to get the reauthorization.
You on mute?
Can you hear me?
Am I missing it? I can't hear Marsha.
I hear you. I hear you.
Okay, you can hear her. Oh, maybe it's me. Okay. Maybe my internet connection said it's unstable. I'm sorry. Go on, Marsha.
Okay, sure. Hopefully some folks can hear me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the TVPA reauthorization was the main thing that we were working on at the end of the year with various appropriations bills. It can get a little dicey. So getting that passed was a big success. We're currently not tracking anything, but we always have our eyes open. So if there's anything coming up, you can find alerts on the Justice for Immigrants page.
And is that the Justice for Immigrants.org? Is that the place where people will go to get kind of all this information that you shared with us today, both Felicitas and Marsha? Would that be?
Yeah, so that page is new. On USCCB's website, Anti-Trafficking program, you can find a lot of modules and stuff like that. On our BRICS website as well, which I can include here, is a lot of the other modules we have on Human Trafficking 101. The Justice for Immigrants page, as Marsha was saying, kind of just launched. So we're trying to like slowly move everything there and see how to, build a place in which everyone can kind of find all the resources needed.
Okay, thank you. Because like me, it's like sometimes I have to kind of go back and, revisit because it was a lot of good information. And so we appreciate you joining us on today. So I don't see any other questions in our chat. So again, we thank Felicitas and Marsha for joining us on this important webinar. And I'm sure we will probably be revisiting this subject again because it is an ongoing problem. I know here in Chicago, we've had a lot of missing Black women, don't know what happened, could be a human trafficking situation. We have kids that have, missing across the country. And so, it is something for us to always be aware of and to always be cognizant and look for ways that we can recognize maybe those individuals that are being trafficked in case they come into our presence. So I appreciate that information on today. There is one last question that somebody popped in here. So we got 1 minute. Does Texas still consider a main route for interest of traffic groups?
So yes and no, I guess, by the nature of where Texas is, and there's of course a lot of immigration coming in there. You see a lot kind of the intersection of smuggling and trafficking. So yes and no. The US also has a lot of trafficking in rural kind of towns. You see it a lot as well in the main ports. So, Miami, New York, California, you see it in these kind of main ports where a lot of things are imported goods and things like that. So to answer yes and no at the same time.
Okay. Well, thank you again. As we wrap up, this has been recorded. So the recording will be sent out to all those who register for this webinar. And you can go back and listen to it and see the links of all the things that were put in our chat so that you can get any information that you can. Again, we thank you for joining us on today, and we appreciate your support and continue to come back and help us, make our webinars and town halls and all of our seminars a success and let us help you in your ministry. Take care and have a blessed week.